The Jews are in fact the Palestinians. The only people who gave Palestine a name were the Jews, because Palestine is just another name for Judea. The Arabs never called it Palestine.
Who gave them that name?
Who gave them that name? The Romans, and then the British in the 19th century started to call Palestine, because of course it was in the Roman name. The British liked the Roman names. They liked the Roman name Mesopotamia. They used the ancient names. And
why did the Romans call the Jews? Why did they call it Palestine?
Well, they called it Palestine because they wanted to kick the Jews in the face after the Second Jewish Revolt, because the Philistina it is, and the Philistines were the Greek sea people who were always fighting with King David in the Bible. But they weren't there anymore. They weren't there anymore, and there were no Arabs, and the Arabs are not the Palestinians. The only people who were in 135 AD, the Jews became the Palestinians. It was a change of name.
And that was used as an insult?
It was a kick in the face. They still called themselves Jews. They still called it the land of Israel, but to the Roman world and to the Byzantine world that came afterward, that land was called Syria Palestina. But there was never a nation called Palestine. Okay? Never a nation in history called Palestine. There was only the United Kingdom of Israel and Judea in ancient times. Judea at the time of King Herod, he was the king of Judea. And the first nation to be called Israel again in 1948 was Israel. Between that, it was called Palestine, and it was a dead wasteland. You read Mark Twain's observations on that land. It was a mess. It was a deserted mess. The Peel Commission had actually reported that for 1,000 years, the Arabs had done nothing with Palestine. There were only 250,000 people in the 19th century, but as soon as the Jewish immigration came in, sponsored originally by English Zionists and later on by Herzl's Zionist movement, the Jewish population grew, investment grew, swampland became a farmland, and Arabs came in to get the jobs from Syria, from Egypt and other nations. Employment was created for Arabs out of the Jewish lands. The Jews purchased other lands off the Bedouin and other Arabs living in the country legally, and that allowed the Arabs actually to make some money and get rich off of Jewish immigration. But what is the Palestine Orchestra? It was a Jewish orchestra. What are the Palestine papers? It was a Jewish newspaper. The Jews, next year in Jerusalem, go back to Palestine. Everybody called it Palestine because that was the name, but they were always going to call it the land of Israel again once they got their independence. The Jewish nation was built gradually from the late 19th century, and especially from the 1920s until 1948. But the Jews had to fight for their independence from the British eventually. The British gave it up. The United Nations offered to partition Western Palestine, which is now Israel, into an Arab state and a Jewish state. Now that's already giving up too much land because they'd already given up Jordan. So now they were asked to give up the whole of the land they were promised, or half of the land they were promised. They accepted it. And what happened? The Arabs said no and invaded and tried to destroy Israel. As a result, Israel got most of the land except for the old ancient Jewish lands of Judea and Samaria, which the Jordan annexed and called it West Bank. You get to the 1967 war. The Egyptians wanted to invade and destroy Israel. Again, this time Israel got more land. They got the Sinai, they got Gaza, they got the Judea and Samaria back. Then they went to the Arabs and said, let's negotiate. And the Arabs said, no, no, no. 1973 war followed, another attempt to wipe out the country.
The three no's, that was in Sudan, wasn't it?
Sorry?
It was in Sudan, the three no's.
Yes, in Sudan.
No negotiation, what was it? No?
I can't remember.
No negotiation, no recognition, and no peace.
Yes. See, you're better than me. So, after the 1973 war, which almost resulted in the destruction of Israel, Israel still controlled the Sinai and all of the lands that were part of Greater Israel. And then Jimmy Carter came up with Camp David and the peace treaty. And suddenly, instead of labor governments, which managed to be strong Israeli nationalists, we had Likud governments which should have been more right-wing, more believing in Greater Israel, and they gave up the Sinai to Egypt for peace, giving up land for peace. They did get the peace from Egypt. That was the only land they got it from. But then when the Oslo Accords came in 1993, all it was was the Palestinians knowing that they couldn't defeat the Jews militarily or the Arabs defeat Israel militarily. They were trying to break them down in a process piece by piece. They kept turning down offers of 98% of Judea and Samaria, 95% of Judea and Samaria, all turned down up to 2008. There were 4 times. The most famous was when Yasser Arafat walked away after Clinton tried to get a Palestinian state formed in 2000, and that failed. The Palestinians don't want a state. They want
How much was it? How much percentage did Israel offer Yasser Arafat?
I think it was 98%.
Yeah.
98%. The point is the Palestinians never wanted a state because Yasser Arafat wants the whole land from the Jordan River to the sea. If he accepted a state, he then would have moved in to take more because the Palestinians, if they accepted a state, already would have said, what about the 1947 division? We want that land too. They basically want to delegitimize Israel. They've used, first there was the Zionism as racism in 1974 with the United Nations, which the Russians backed, which lasted a long time. And then there was the whole process of the BDS movement, which was founded by a Palestinian and which is in work today in Manchester and all over the world, where they're boycotting Israeli academics, Israeli businesses, Israeli banks around the world. And that is not succeeding, but there are a number of major boycotts going on. There are some banks that won't deal with Israel. There are shops being boycotted in this country. There are academics being boycotted in the United States. There's a lot of controversy about that. They're trying to destroy Israel by delegitimizing the Jewish people. In fact, the Palestinians are trying to come up with the new Palestinian Jesus. Jesus wasn't a Palestinian. Wasn't a Jew. He was a Palestinian. In fact, that's another myth that, in fact, some of the Christian churches are buying into. Of course Jesus was a Jew. He was a rabbi. There were no Palestinians. Well, there were no Palestinian Arabs back then because the Arabs came in the 7th century and they didn't do much with that. The Jews are trying to steal Arab history. The Arabs are trying to steal Jewish history. Stop for a minute.